I'm Laryssa Lamrock. I'm National Strategic Advisor for Families with the Atlas Institute. I'm also a person with lived experience, so I'm the family member of a veteran who was medically released for PTSD and depression. I've worked in the field of peer support for about 15 years. I understand the power of peer support, and I'm also co-chair of the Peer Support Community Network.
My name is Beth Milliard. I'm a serving police officer with York Regional Police in Ontario. I'm also a postdoc with CIPSRT, working on the PSCN, which is Stream 1. I guess this is very near and dear to my heart because, one, I come from a policing family. In addition to being a police officer, I'm also married to a police officer. My two brother-in-laws are police officer, and my sister-in-law is a police officer. And I also grew up in a policing family. So my dad was a 30-year police officer. So I see mental health in a couple different lenses. And I also did my dissertation on the effectiveness of peer support. So I wear many hats, and I'm here as a peer support provider, creator, and someone who myself has gotten peer support after many critical incidents in my career.
Peer Support Community Network is a joint collaboration between CIPSRT and the Atlas Institute. And the importance of the Peer Support Community Network was identified because there isn't really a network of folks to be able to come together to talk about peer support specific to PSP and veterans and their families. So this was an opportunity to bring a number of experts into the room to start to share best practices, have conversations about peer support. And our first project being the undertaking of developing guidelines that are specific to PSP veterans and families.
The Peer Support Community Network is created to create those best practices. The other important thing is for everybody to be following the same script, because when we go to research peer support and the effectiveness of it, it's good that everybody's on the same page when it comes to definitions of peer support and how that looks in an organization. So another thing at the PSCN that we are trying to get through is that consistent definition of peer support. The importance of the PSCN is actually bringing together people from across Canada, diverse people. And when I talk about diverse, I mean, when we talk about peer support, we're looking at mental health clinicians, researchers, policymakers, people who provide peer support, and people who receive peer support. So the goal of the PSCN is to bring those members together and kind of create a consensus of what's important. And we are currently looking at the Mental Health Commission of Canada peer support guidelines, which are very well written. However, they're missing those nuances from our specific sectors like veterans, police, firefighters, corrections. So having those people come together to be a collaborative voice is super important.
I think it's been pretty powerful that the people that we've brought together have had a range of experience, from providing peer support for less than a year to being involved in the field for over 20 years. So having all of those folks in the room sharing their experience across that timeline, as I said, is pretty powerful. And it's been really important to have that variety of diverse experiences, from policymakers and people who are creating peer support to those that are delivering it, because again, they have different perspectives. And we've been able to kind of amalgamate all of that in moving the PSCN and the development of the guidelines forward.
So the first major goal was the actual recruitment and retaining the peer support community network. So that work was done a couple of years ago by Dr. Jill Price, who was part of CIPSRT. And through her environmental scan, she kind of identified those key people, those champions in peer support across Canada, like I talked about, from all the different sectors. So once we had a pool, then we, created an MOU with Atlas to also look at people from the veteran side and families, because we also wanted to include them. So once we did that, we came together and we actually, between myself and Laryssa, went through the list and really looked at the list through an EDI lens to make sure we were capturing people right across Canada, in addition to having that diversity.
And as we said, peer support is organic, it happens naturally. But what we heard from the community pretty clearly was that there are certain considerations we need to put into place when we're providing peer support to this particular demographic, being PSP and veterans. Really, we know that they are a culture of their own within them. They have subcultures. They have unique circumstances and experiences, and really know by nature of their work that they are kind of committing a certain part of themselves, and there's a bit of a risk in the work that they do. So it's important to capture those unique needs and experiences within peer support. And so we very quickly identified that one of our first goals needed to be the development of the guidelines that were specific to the community. What we're seeing is that there are some similarities across PSP uniformed members as well as veterans when it comes to mental health issues. As an example, most peer support programs don't encourage people to talk about their specific trauma. It's more about talking about the experience of it. So if someone is experiencing nightmares or communication issues with their families, or they don't know where to go for support and services, I think that's fairly unique and common across all of those services. But we're also identifying and listening to the peer support community network and understanding that there are also unique needs among each of the services and that there are some subtle differences.
In regards to even just looking at PSP and veterans, the stigma itself in reaching out for help is huge. It's a big thing that we have in common. The other thing that we have in common is the families. The families are often affected, right? They're usually the first line of defense when people are, struggling as a veteran or as a PSP. However, the difference is, and this is where we want to talk about when creating the best practices for peer support, is these nuances. So for example, as a police officer, I go home every night. Military, you're deployed and you could be gone for months. So that's a little bit different. And also as a police officer, we typically work alone. We ride around in a car alone. We may have backup when we go to a call, depending. If you work in northern remote areas, you're usually alone. Where military, they eat together, sleep together, train together, and they're always in a team. So the whole thing about mental health and getting that support, it's the same, but there are those subtle differences. And those are the things from the PSCN that we really want to capture when we're creating these guidelines is we're the same, but there are some differences. In 2020, I completed my PhD dissertation in the effectiveness of peer support. And one of the reasons why I chose that as my dissertation is because there was a huge gap in the literature. So many PSP organizations say you should have a peer support, you should develop a peer support, but no one actually really studied the effectiveness of it. So from my own personal experience, being a police officer, providing peer support and getting peer support, I really thought it was important, and especially from a Canadian perspective, is to study it, the effectiveness of it. In addition to that, there's been a few studies done through CIPSRT and postdocs there regarding the whole guidelines, best practices.
We've had a few meetings with the PSCN. First, kind of establishing our goals for the PSCN. We provided an opportunity for networking amongst the different peer support experts in the field, but now focusing on the guidelines. So we've provided some background information, the Mental Health Commission of Canada peer support guidelines, the work by Dr. Jill Price, as well as work informed by Beth, to give them kind of a foundation and able to inform the creation and advancement of the guidelines. So we will kind of continue identifying topics and themes that the community has identified as important and including and acknowledging within the guidelines. And then we'll move to producing them and then disseminating them throughout the community, because we understand that that's an important part of it. We don't want to create guidelines that are going to kind of sit on a shelf. We want them to be utilized and kind of evolve as we hear from the community what's beneficial from them, and maybe, future considerations and iterations as peer support advances. One of the things that the PSCN has kept in sight is the importance of the involvement of families. So not just an extension of support to the PSP or veteran, but also the support that families require in their own right. So as we're advancing and developing the peer support guidelines, we will also consider whether this model could be used for peer support specific to families in each of the services.